This is America, and time is ticking. Collapse talks and a U.S. naval blockade are testing the limits of the ceasefire with Iran. What options does America have left? Or does it find itself squeezed into a corner? I'll be back with more on that later. But first, here's Anna Burns-Francis in our Washington studio.
Thanks, Heidi. America is now weighing its options, but so too is Iran. So who will make the first move? Alan Fisher joins us from the White House today, and Mike Hanna is at the State Department. They are two of the branches of the administration working on a diplomatic resolution to the conflict in the Middle East after 21 hours of weekend talks ended with no agreement.
What our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could, and they have chosen not to accept our terms.
But it was far from the end of the discussion, at least according to Donald Trump.
I can tell you that we've been called by the other side. They'd like to make a deal very badly.
At the same time, the president launched an offensive on the Strait of Hormuz, threatening to hurt Iran's economy in the same way it's putting pressure on its neighbours. There are now 8 days left of the ceasefire. So where to from here? Donald Trump could go ahead with a renewed airstrike campaign, as he threatened before the ceasefire. Military analysts believe this could include the bombing of civilian infrastructure like the power grid. There are also suggestions the US could further its blockade by attacking Iranian vessels in the Strait of Hormuz or by attacking ports from where Iran exports oil and gas. There's also the option of a ground invasion, which would be seen as a major escalation. Targets could include Kharg Island to control energy exports or the seizing of nuclear sites. There are, of course, non-military options, including the possibility of resuming diplomatic talks with Iran. US officials have already said they're discussing holding another round. There's also the option of back-channel talks through intermediaries like Pakistan, Turkey or Oman. This is how the US and Iran usually communicate. The US could also offer simply to extend the current ceasefire and pull back naval vessels from the Strait of Hormuz, easing pressure on Iran in the hope of encouraging cooperation. So, which option will the US pursue? In a moment, Mike Hanna joins us from the State Department, but first let's go to Alan Fisher, who joins us from the White House. Alan, what is Donald Trump's bottom line and where does it leave any talks?
Well, something you have to remember with Donald Trump is that his deadlines tend to be elastic. So we now have 8 days before this ceasefire ends. If there is a bright spot with the collapse of the talks in Pakistan, it would be that neither side walked away and said, we're done, we're not doing this anymore, it's over. Remember, there's a trust deficit on the side of the Iranians. They've been involved in discussions with the Americans twice in recent months, and they found themselves under attack. They want to make sure that that can't happen again. Donald Trump, speaking outside the Oval Office on Monday, made it clear what his bottom line would be, that Iran can have no nuclear weapons. It's something he's campaigned on very vigorously during his 3 election campaigns. And again he said that he simply will not let it happen. But what we're hearing from the talks is there is the possibility that he may sign off on the idea of Iran not obtaining nuclear weapons for a set period of time. He's got a couple of things to think about. One, he said he doesn't want to get into an extended war in the Middle East. And 2, he wants a better Iran nuclear deal than the one Barack Obama set up. He'd like to get a deal. He'd like to get it done soon. The next 8 days are going to be pretty crucial.
If you'd like a deal, then Mike, let's bring you in at the State Department. Can you talk us through about what we know of those attempts to revive diplomatic talks?
Well, these diplomatic talks have in effect been upended by a complete destruction of diplomatic norms, by which I mean it's the State Department that normally leads the negotiation and is the central player in such negotiations. Not so in the situation now. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, did play a part in earlier discussions, was part of the negotiating teams in talks that were broken when the US launched surprise attacks on Iran. But since this current conflict began, the US and Israel waging their war on Iran, the Secretary of State has been increasingly sidelined to the extent that he was effectively pushed out of the negotiating team and replaced by the Vice President J.D. Vance, who was signaled by President Trump to head the negotiating team. The Secretary of State, well, while those talks were taking place in Pakistan, in fact, on that very night that the talks ended, the Secretary of State was sitting with President Trump at an Ultimate Fighting Championship match in Miami, Florida. So he has not been playing a role. Why is this the case? Well, largely it would appear because it gives President Trump the opportunity to have a more direct hand on the parameters of negotiations, on the direction that they takes, not being constrained by the presence of the State Department, preferring to upset diplomatic norms and keep control rather than involve his Secretary of State.
Mike Hanna at the State Department and Alan Fisher at the White House. Thank you both. Well, as the US and Iran reach the halfway mark in their 2-week-long ceasefire, there are lots of questions about what the Trump administration can do, either to end the war or continue it. Rosalind Jordan looks at the options and complications.
21 hours of talks in Islamabad, but no deal between the U.S. and Iran to end their war. President Donald Trump said Iranian officials wouldn't accept his top demand.
Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. And we agreed to a lot of things, but they didn't agree to that. And I think they will agree to it. I'm almost sure of it. In fact, I am sure of it. If they don't agree, there's no deal.
But what happens now? The 2-week-long ceasefire ends on April 21st, and the U.S. must decide now what to do next. The U.S. Navy started enforcing a blockade of Iranian ports on Monday, despite Qatar's call on both the U.S. and Iran to permit freedom of navigation and to continue indirect talks. Some speculate Trump might order an invasion of Karj Island, home to Iran's main oil terminal. At least 4,000 U.S. Marines who could do so have been deployed to the region. Trump has also threatened to use ground troops to seize Iran's enriched uranium stockpile, an estimated 450 kilograms. But that raises the possibility of U.S. troops dying in combat. Pakistani, Egyptian, and Turkish officials are trying to keep alive the possibility of another high-level meeting soon. The U.S. reportedly is open to the idea, but nothing's been scheduled. There are other complications facing the Trump administration in the coming days. The longer the blockade on Iran, the more likely global energy prices will keep rising, and the more likely consumers will suffer. The political problem. A majority of Americans already opposes the war, and a resumption of U.S. military action could prove to be very unpopular. And what steps will the U.S. take to prevent Iran from controlling the Strait of Hormuz, and at what cost? So far, no clear plan for doing so. Statesmen say that war is what happens when diplomacy fails. But in the U.S. war on Iran, diplomacy is playing catch-up, with no promise it will prevail. Rosalind Jordan, Al Jazeera, Washington.
American media is also been closely examining the options that Donald Trump has on the table. Here's Heidi Jo Castro with a closer look.
We're here at the National Press Club, just blocks from the White House, with a look at how the American media is viewing Washington's potential next moves. Let's start with the country's most watched news channel, the conservative Fox News. Its coverage focused less on the uncertainty, more on what American forces are currently doing.
Now, the U.S. military has started the process of clearing mines from the Strait of Hormuz as the U.S. moves to end Tehran's stranglehold on that key shipping lane. It's a big deal right now, and it could be a major move forward in the strategy to wind down this war.
Lots of optimism there. The conservative-leaning Wall Street Journal also highlighted forward action, writing, "The White House is considering a menu of options in addition to blockading the Strait of Hormuz. Those options include resuming limited military strikes in Iran, a full-fledged bombing campaign, and pressuring allies to take responsibility for a prolonged military escort mission through the Strait of Hormuz." On the left, CNN says there is still hope for negotiations, reporting Trump officials are internally discussing details for a potential second in-person meeting with Iranian officials before the ceasefire between Washington and Tehran expires next week. Finally, we'll finish off with some humor. Saturday Night Live, with its 4.5 million viewers, dwarfs even the audience of Fox News. Here's SNL's parody newscast of how things went in Islamabad.
Before the talks fell apart, President Trump warned Iran about making any more demands, saying the Iranians don't seem to realize they have no cards. They're literally holding us straight.
Some gallows humor, some predictions of more military action, and a bit of cautious optimism that talks may resume. That is our survey of the U.S. press landscape as the clock ticks toward a ceasefire expiration.
That's how the US media is looking at it, but what do the experts think? Joining us today is former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence, David Sidney, and former US Ambassador and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, Richard Schmierer. Thank you both, gentlemen, for coming in today. David, I'll start with you. What is the most realistic option on the table, the number one option, constructive talks or a counter-offensive?
The number one option, I think, is clearly for all involved, is a resumption of talks. The announcement today of likely talks in 2 days, I think, shows we're leaning in that direction. But given the uncertainties involved, other options could come into play. But it looks to me as if the administration would really like to do at least a second round of talks. At the same time, they're doing talks between Israel and Lebanon and Washington, so there's a lot of moving pieces here.
Yeah, it's sort of like I'm asking you to choose one, but all options are on the table. Ambassador, if you were in that room, what option would you be leveraging right now?
Well, I agree with David that I think there is some real potential for diplomatic success. I know that we saw diplomatic failure in recent days, but always diplomatic negotiations start out with maximalist positions on both sides. So I think both sides have now presented their maximalist positions, and now in the days since we've been hearing of some potential areas for compromise, diluting the uranium, a 5-year moratorium. Things like that show that there's room for some discussion, some compromise, and I don't think either side wants to go back to military action, so I think and I hope that what we'll see is some diplomatic success.
Was it a failure of talks, or do people like me look at them and think, yes, finally a ceasefire and hopefully a peace deal, but really 21 hours and 2 weeks is all too short a time frame when the last deal in 2015 took 2 years?
Well, you're correct. Any hope that there would be one set of meetings, no matter how many hours, was really overreaching. But the fact that after the first initial rejection by the United States, Vice President Vance's original read of the talks was very negative. But as soon as he returned to Washington and spoke with President Trump, his tune changed. And it looks as if the United States really does want to have this other round of talks. Another item I'd mention is the role of China. The country that's most impacted by the U.S. blockade of the Straits is China, because Chinese shipping was getting through until the U.S. blockaded. The Iranians weren't blocking the Chinese. President Trump delayed his April summit with Xi Jinping. He's committed to a May summit. The Chinese are not happy with the U.S. blockade.
No.
And the U.S. had some cards to play with Iran as well.
I want to come back to that point in a moment, but Ambassador, you mentioned maximalist positions, and then David, you mentioned J.D. Vance and his rather negative tone, and the quote that he said was, "We've made it very clear what our red lines are. They have chosen not to accept our terms." Does that indicate a sense that this was really a very one-way dialogue? You either take it or leave it?
Well, it may have been his intention to try to signal that this is it or we're leaving. I think really what he maybe meant by red lines is these are our maximalist positions, but we might be able to walk back from them somewhat. And I think we've seen in the last couple of days those kind of compromise positions. So again, I do think there is reason to believe that the two sides will begin to stand down from their maximalist positions. We've already seen some ability of the two to come together. And on the issue of the ceasefire, my expectation is this won't get done by the end of the ceasefire, but that the ceasefire will be extended. That would be my expectation.
There certainly is the pressure. A post-mortem of the weekend appears to have prompted back-channel talks of some kind, with the president declaring it was Iran who had come crawling back.
I can tell you that we've been called by the other side. They'd like to make a deal very badly, very badly. We've been called this morning by the right people, the appropriate people, and they want to work a deal. They would like to work a deal.
Not to labour the point here, David, but is there a peace deal? Will it be reliant on Iran accepting US terms?
It's going to be reliant upon Iran accepting some of the U.S. terms, but also in the U.S. accepting and finding a way forward to meet some of the Iranian terms. And that's why I mentioned before the talks between Israel and Lebanon. These talks originally foundered when Iran said they believed that the ceasefire was extending to Lebanon as well. The Pakistanis said the Iranians were right to have believed that. There was clearly some miscommunication. That's an area where the Iranians have signaled they want to see something on the Lebanon front. And I think President Trump can deliver that. He can get the Israelis to stop or slow down or stop their offensive there. And that may be the trigger that releases the rest of the negotiations to move forward.
You mentioned, Ambassador, timelines and whether we actually see any tangible progress, I should say, out of this next round. What options does the US have if there is no firm agreement and it is just an extension of the ceasefire while they work their way through? What are the other options?
Well, I mean, potentially one could go back to military activity, but I think that would be quite unpopular in the U.S. and sort of internationally. There's a lot of pressure to not do that.
Do you mean politically or with the voting public in America?
I would say both. Certainly, the American public writ large does not support military activity in the region, and even specifically the supporters of the president have not wanted him to take these kinds of actions. So I think there's a political dynamic there that President Trump will have to be sensitive to. And I think there are options for him to not have to go back to military activity, because I think we can expect to see some progress in the coming days, and maybe then an extension of the ceasefire, and then more progress. I think we're going to see a period where this slowly works its way out.
President Trump had several options after the weekend's peace talks collapsed. His first one aiming to inflict pain and pressure on Iran, preventing Iranian tankers from exiting the Strait of Hormuz and stopping Tehran from charging tolls for ships to transit through. The goal, maximum economic pain. The US president also sees the opportunity for America to make more money through the blockade. Trump claims massive numbers of empty tankers are headed to the US to buy its oil. It's all coming at a time when Iran is seeking much-needed sanctions relief. Its closure of the strait has driven up energy, food and fertilizer prices around the world. David, did President Trump call Iran's bluff by putting in his own blockade on the strait?
Not at all. I think actually Iran has called his bluff because the pressure from other countries, particularly China, India, South Korea, countries that are hurting much more than the United States is from the current closure of the strait. So I don't think President Trump has done any kind of masterstroke here. I think what he has done is he's ratcheted up the pressure on himself. But I'll have to go back to the issue you mentioned before. For President Trump, it's always about domestic politics. His support among his base is slipping, and it's slipped even more. Some comments he made about the Pope over the weekend. He's about to lose a primary that was very important to him in the state of Kentucky. This is a president who needs his base's support. His base is not going to support those military options. His base wants an end to the war and lower gas prices.
You mentioned the sort of pressure he's on. Pressure on the president to resolve the conflict is coming from all sides, and as David mentioned, not least from within his own party.
And to me, finishing the job is to make sure that Iran can never produce a nuclear weapon. They can no longer enrich uranium, that hopefully we can remove that enriched uranium, that they can no longer hold the Strait of Hormuz hostage, that they can no longer brutalize the Iranian people. They can no longer be a sponsor of state terror. So we have to finish the job. Again, there's multiple ways of potentially doing it. Short term, long term, there are multiple avenues we can approach here, but we have not yet finished the job.
Ambassador, what does finish the job mean there?
I don't think there is a realistic military solution to the challenges we face in Iran. Yes, we're unhappy with their support for these militias. We're unhappy with their ballistic missile program, and we're most unhappy with their nuclear program. But I think right now we're focused on trying to address the nuclear program, absolutely to make sure Iran cannot find a path to a nuclear weapon. And I think that's what's going to dominate the discussions going forward.
Yeah, it is already the talking point about what never having a nuclear weapon means? And does it mean 5 years, as Iran has reportedly asked for, or does it mean 20, David, or can it mean forever?
Well, I think you just laid out the parameters for negotiation. Iran apparently has offered a 5-year suspension. The U.S. has been seeking a 20-year suspension of nuclear activities. As representatives of the Obama administration have said, if there's any suspension of Iranian nuclear activity, that's more than President Obama was able to achieve in the JCPOA. So President Trump can claim a victory, even if it's only 5 years. But I think that 5 to 20-year period of time will be the focus of the negotiations.
We've talked a bit about the frustration from within America domestically, and you've also mentioned internationally. Frustration from overseas countries not involved is mounting, with UK Chancellor Rachel Reeves telling the Mirror newspaper it was a war the UK did not start and did not want.
I feel very frustrated and angry that the US went into this war without a clear exit plan, without a clear idea of what they were trying to achieve. And as a result, the Strait of Hormuz is now blocked.
David, I will ask you about China in a moment, but Ambassador, goodness, that's very strongly worded comments from a representative of a very close ally to America.
Well, I think what happened is the expectations of the military activity did not lead to the goals that they were hoping to achieve, which was change in the regime, or at least change in the regime's policies. And so as a result, clearly our allies and even our own country are disappointed that we are where we are, because we've undertaken this military activity and we have not achieved the strategic goals that we were seeking. So now we seem to have to find a diplomatic way to end the confrontation, address the nuclear issue, that has to happen, and then end the conflict.
If that is the sort of pressure that is being spoken about publicly from an American ally, what is the discussion from an ally happening behind closed doors that would influence the decisions that Donald Trump makes?
Well, I would hope our allies would support any effort that we can make to try to resolve our current differences with Iran, to come back to something like the former Iran deal, maybe with better terms, maybe with no domestic enrichment for 5 years. I think we can get our allies to support that effort. That kind of rebinds the alliance in ways that right now are under great strain.
The other point of pressure here, David, though, is, as you mentioned, on China. What sort of pressure, and we've seen them also come out with some fairly strongly worded, albeit indirect statements, but what kind of pressure is at play there?
Well, the pressure on China is economic, first of all. China depends upon Iran for a lot of its energy. China today said that the U.S. blockade of the Straits was dangerous and irresponsible. That's a very strong language for the Chinese to use. While people focus on the 30-day future price, the actual price that people are paying for oil in East Asia right now for a cargo of oil is about $140 to $150 a barrel. Yeah. So the Chinese and the South Koreans are paying that price. But the Chinese are also playing the long game. The Chinese see the U.S. as acting in a way of a weak power, not as a strong power, and the Chinese are collecting. You mentioned the British before. Prime Minister Starmer was just in China a little over a month ago, making some very big deals with China. Very clearly, Prime Minister Starmer, the UK Labour Party, doesn't like President Trump. They're happy to deal with somebody else. And as we saw in the elections in Hungary, the anti-Trump, anti-authoritarianism swing is going against Trump in Europe. So Trump is losing on the world stage. And for him, he's probably better to get an agreement on Iran as soon as possible so he doesn't lose any more.
Yeah, without damaging those relationships, Ambassador. I'm wondering if the decisions that Donald Trump and the options that he feels he has on the table at this point will not only be dictated towards ending the conflict, but how much does he also have to consider the ire of his allies at the moment, or damaging the relationships further that he has?
Well, I think there's going to have to be a period of kind of rebuilding those alliances, because the way we entered the war without consulting with anybody, and then criticizing allies for not coming in to help when we, of course, created the issues that were a problem. So I think that certainly has alienated many. As David mentioned, we've heard a number of comments from European leaders. That plus the fact that Europe has rejected Orban, and therefore maybe there's a different sentiment in Europe in general. I think that's going to put some challenges on President Trump to rebuild those relationships, maybe more in light of European interests than his previous approach.
Richard Smearer, thank you so much for coming in. David Sidney, thank you to you as well. The American public has also been combing over the possible scenarios moving forward as that fragile ceasefire enters its final week. Alex Baird has the roundup.
Well, the time is ticking on that ceasefire, and Vice President J.D. Vance is being clear any diplomatic route forward is on US terms.
They moved in our direction, which is why I think we would say that we had some good signs, but they didn't move far enough.
Top political scientist Professor Robert Pape believes that means one thing. Military escalation is just around the corner. Pape seeing those failed talks and that deadlock over Hormuz as leading to a new and dangerous phase. And more of this, what he calls the escalation trap. Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton also casting doubt on a successful diplomatic solution.
I don't see this administration either wanting to do it or, frankly, being capable of doing it.
But for President Trump, that's rubbish. Publicly, he's still confident in the art of the deal.
I can tell you that we've been called by the other side. They'd like to make a deal very badly.
Iran's embassies going viral here in the States for creating videos like this. Trump being trolled for thinking this would all be easy peasy. Mega commentator Gunter Eagleman saying videos like that are masking the reality that Iran is cracking under pressure. Tehran desperate for a deal with President Trump. While former Secretary of State under Trump, Mike Pompeo, is waiting to see if Iran will fire on those American vessels blockading the Strait of Hormuz.
President Trump will unleash even more fury, and that can only put them in a lesser position.
For former national counterterrorism boss Joe Kent, any further talks are doomed if they don't take into account one important factor: Israel. He says if Israel's war aims are not restrained, there won't be a diplomatic solution. He says they need to be treated as a junior partner and stay in their lane. Above all, the American public are confused. Blockades, blockading, blockades of blockades, unclear messaging with little indication as to what will happen next.
That's all from the team here in Washington, D.C. On This Is America, we'll keep following the decisions that shape the US. We'll hand back to the team in Doha. Thanks for joining us.